I have spent 43 years keeping a secret that has cost me 2 marriages, my career with the United States Geological Survey, and very nearly my sanity. My name is Dr. Marcus Whitfield. I am 71 years old, and I am speaking to you from a small cabin in rural Vermont, a place I chose specifically because it is as far as I could get from the forests of the Pacific Northwest while remaining in the continental United States. 3 months ago, my doctors gave me 6 months to live. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, inoperable. Some men might spend their remaining time with family making peace with their lives, but I have no family left. My first wife Linda left me in 1984, unable to cope with the man I became after that summer. My second wife Catherine lasted until 1997 before she too walked away, convinced I was either mentally ill or hiding something unforgivable. She was right about the second part. What I discovered in the summer of 1981 deep in the forests of Olympic National Park changed everything I thought I understood about the nature of reality itself. I found structures in those woods that defy every principle of geology, physics, and natural law. I encountered beings that slip between dimensions as easily as you and I walk through doorways, and I learned a truth so profound, so terrifying, and so beautiful that I have carried it alone for over 4 decades. Unable to speak it aloud for fear of what it might cost me, for fear of what it might cost the world. I have nothing left to lose now. The cancer will take me soon enough. Before I go, someone needs to know the truth about what lives in those woods and where they actually come from. Someone needs to understand that the reality we perceive, this solid world of matter and energy and predictable physics, is merely one layer of something far more complex than our sciences have ever imagined. But to understand what I found, you need to understand who I was before that summer and why I was in those woods in the first place. In 1981, I was 38 years old and at the height of my career. I held a PhD in geology from Stanford University and had spent the previous 12 years as a senior field researcher with the United States Geological Survey. My specialty was geological anomalies, the strange formations and mineral deposits that didn't fit neatly into established categories. I was the scientist they called when something didn't make sense. My reputation was built on skepticism and rigorous methodology. I had debunked supposed meteorite impact sites, explained away mysterious cave formations, and consistently found rational explanations for phenomena that others considered unexplainable. I believed, with the absolute certainty that only a scientist can possess, that every mystery had a solution grounded in observable, measurable reality. If I couldn't see it, touch it, or run it through a spectrometer, it wasn't real. That was my creed. I drove a 1978 Ford Bronco forest green with over 100,000 miles on the odometer. The back was permanently configured for field work, loaded with topographic maps, sampling equipment, a Nikon FM camera that I had used to document hundreds of sites, and a reel-to-reel tape recorder for field notes. There were no cell phones in 1981, no GPS units, no satellite communication. When you went into the backcountry, you went alone with your skills and your equipment, and if something went wrong, you either solved it yourself or you didn't come back. My marriage to Linda was strained that summer. She was tired of me disappearing into wilderness for months at a time, tired of raising our daughter essentially alone, tired of competing with rocks and trees for my attention. We had argued bitterly before I left for this assignment, words said that couldn't be taken back. I welcomed the isolation of field work. It was easier to face the wilderness than to face the wreckage of my personal life. The assignment came in June of 1981 from the Department of Interior. A logging survey team operating in a remote section of Olympic National Park had reported finding unusual crystalline formations in an area they were assessing for potential timber harvest. Their report described structures that shouldn't exist according to the known geology of the region. The Olympic Peninsula is characterized by sedimentary and volcanic rock, the remnants of ancient seafloor thrust upward by tectonic forces. Large crystalline formations simply don't occur there naturally. Someone needed to investigate and document the anomaly, to determine whether it represented a previously unknown geological feature or simply a misidentification by untrained observers. I was assigned a standard 30-day solo expedition. Document the crystals, take samples, file a report. Routine work for a man of my experience. I remember the drive from Seattle to the trailhead, winding through smaller and smaller roads as civilization fell away behind me. Fleetwood Mac played on the radio, their Rumors album still in heavy rotation 4 years after its release. Ronald Reagan had been inaugurated just months earlier. The hostages had finally come home from Iran. The country felt optimistic, forward-looking, convinced that its best days lay ahead. I felt none of that optimism. I felt only relief at escaping the tension of my home life and a professional curiosity about what the logging team had found. The trailhead was a muddy pullout at the end of a Forest Service road, unmarked on any tourist map. From there, the logging team's coordinates indicated a 3-day hike through increasingly rugged terrain. I shouldered my pack, locked the Bronco, and walked into the ancient forest without looking back. I remember thinking as I walked deeper into those ancient forests that this would be a routine assignment. Document the crystals, take some samples, write a report nobody would read. I had no idea I was walking towards something that would shatter every assumption I'd ever made about the world. The Olympic rainforest is unlike anywhere else on Earth. The old-growth trees rise like the pillars of some vast organic cathedral, their canopy so thick that even at midday the forest floor exists in a perpetual twilight. Moss hangs from every surface in great draping curtains, giving the trees a primordial, almost alien appearance. The air is thick with moisture, heavy with the smell of decay and growth intertwined, the constant cycle of death feeding life, feeding death. Every fallen log becomes a nurse log, spawning new trees from its rotting flesh. The scale is overwhelming, humbling. You feel small in such a forest, insignificant, temporary. I hiked for 3 days, following compass bearings and topographic contours, camping each night in small clearings where enough light penetrated to dry my gear. The solitude was complete. I saw no other humans, no evidence of human passage. Just the forest, endless and ancient, and the sounds of water and wind and occasional bird song. On the 3rd day, I reached the coordinates provided by the logging survey team and established my base camp in a clearing near a small stream. That first night, I noticed the silence. Not the ordinary silence of wilderness, where you become attuned to the subtle sounds of nature. This was different. After sunset, the forest went utterly quiet. No owls called. No small animals rustled in the undergrowth. Even the stream seemed to flow more quietly, as if the water itself was hushing its voice. I told myself it was imagination, the product of isolation and the unfamiliar environment. I was a scientist. I didn't believe in ominous silences. On the 2nd day at camp, I found tracks near the stream. They were pressed deep into the muddy bank, indicating significant weight, and they were enormous. Each print was at least 18 inches long and proportionally wide, with 5 distinct toe impressions. They looked almost human in their basic structure, but the proportions were wrong, the stride length impossibly great. I told myself they must be bear tracks, distorted by the soft mud, overlapping to create the illusion of a larger print. I didn't believe it even as I thought it, but I had no framework for any other explanation. At the trailhead before I'd begun my hike, an old logger had approached me as I checked my pack. He was weathered and bent, with the look of a man who had spent his entire life in these mountains. He'd asked where I was headed, and when I'd told him the general area, his face had gone pale. "People go missing in that section," he'd said. "The old-timers call it the thin place. You should turn back." I had dismissed his warning as local superstition, the kind of folklore that accumulates around any remote wilderness. Standing by those impossible tracks, his words echoed in my memory with new weight. On the 3rd night, I heard something that defied explanation. A low humming that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, so deep that I felt it in my chest more than heard it with my ears. It rose and fell in waves, almost like breathing, almost like a heartbeat. My compass, which I'd placed on a flat rock near my tent, was spinning lazily, its needle rotating without cause. I emerged from my tent and stood in the darkness, listening, feeling that subsonic pulse run through me like electricity. It lasted perhaps 15 minutes, then faded into silence. In the morning I convinced myself I had dreamed it, but I hadn't dreamed it. My scientific mind generated explanations with desperate efficiency. Magnetic deposits in the underlying rock could affect the compass. Infrasound could be produced by wind moving through certain geological formations or even by seismic microactivity. Unusual animal tracks could be explained by overlapping prints or unfamiliar species. I wrapped myself in these rationalizations like armor. And yet, beneath my conscious thoughts, something older and more primal was stirring. An instinct that predates education, predates language, predates civilization itself. The instinct that tells a prey animal it is being watched. On the morning of my 4th day at base camp, I set out to locate the crystalline formations the logging team had reported. I followed their coordinates northeast through increasingly dense undergrowth, pushing through thickets of salal and devil's club that seemed to resist my passage. After 2 hours of difficult hiking, I noticed the vegetation changing. The plants were growing in unusual patterns, their stems curved and spiraling toward some central point I couldn't yet see. And there were no animals, not even insects. The silence was absolute. Then I saw it. A clearing opened before me, perfectly circular, approximately 40 feet in diameter. The symmetry was too precise to be natural, the edge too clean where forest gave way to open ground. Moss covered the forest floor right up to the boundary of the circle, then stopped as if it had been cut with a knife. And in the center of that impossible clearing, rising from the earth like something grown rather than built, stood a monolith. It was roughly rectangular, perhaps 8 feet tall and 3 feet wide, its surface unlike anything I had ever seen in 30 years of geological study. It appeared to be made of some crystalline material, but it reflected the surrounding forest with perfect clarity, like a mirror. Yet at the same time it seemed to absorb light, creating the paradoxical impression that it was simultaneously the brightest and darkest object in view. I stood at the edge of that clearing for a long time, simply staring. My scientific training urged me forward, demanded observation and documentation and analysis. But something deeper held me back. Some primal recognition that I stood at the threshold of something profound and terrifying. What I found instead was something that should not exist in any forest, in any world, in any reality I understood. And I knew with a certainty that bypassed all rational thought, that nothing would ever be the same again. I forced myself to move, one foot in front of the other, closing the distance between myself and that impossible object. The grass beneath my boots felt different here, springier somehow, as if the very earth was charged with energy. With each step closer, the humming grew stronger, resonating in my chest, vibrating through my teeth. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, but it was overwhelming, like standing too close to a massive power transformer. The monolith rose from the earth as if it had always been there, as if the forest had grown around it rather than the other way around. 8 feet tall, roughly rectangular but with edges that seemed to shift when I looked at them directly. The surface was unlike anything I had ever encountered in 32 years of geological fieldwork. It appeared to be some kind of crystal, but no crystal I knew behaved like this. It reflected the surrounding forest with perfect clarity, yet simultaneously seemed to drink in the light, creating an effect that was deeply disorienting. I circled it slowly, my boots crunching on the strange silence of that clearing. No birds sang here, no insects buzzed. Even the wind seemed to avoid this place. I pulled out my Nikon and began photographing from every angle, burning through roll after roll of film. Through the viewfinder, the monolith looked almost normal, just a strange reflective surface. But when I lowered the camera and looked with my naked eyes, something else emerged. The reflection moved differently than I did. Not obviously, not dramatically, but there was a lag, a hesitation, as if my mirror image was thinking before it copied my movements. I told myself it was a trick of light. I told myself the surface curvature was creating an optical illusion. I told myself anything that would let me maintain my grip on rationality. Then I stepped closer and reached out my hand. The surface was cool to the touch, far cooler than the ambient temperature would suggest. My fingers made contact and I felt a vibration, a pulse that seemed to sync with my own heartbeat. In the reflection, I watched my hand press against the mirror surface. And then I saw something that made me yank my hand back as if I had touched fire. Behind my reflection, in the mirror world, the forest was wrong. The trees were different, taller and twisted in ways that defied normal growth patterns. The sky beyond the canopy wasn't the gray overcast of the Olympic Peninsula. It was purple, streaked with colors I couldn't name. Colors that don't exist in any spectrum I knew. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs. Nothing, just the same old-growth forest I had hiked through for 3 days. The same moss-covered Douglas firs, the same perpetual twilight of the canopy. I turned back to the monolith. My reflection stared back at me, normal now, surrounded by normal trees under a normal sky. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my tape recorder. Field observation, June 17, 1981, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Have located crystalline formation matching survey team description. Object is approximately 8 feet in height, rectangular in shape, composed of an unknown reflective material. Surface temperature significantly below ambient. Strong electromagnetic interference detected, compass inoperable, watch has stopped, recommend immediate. I paused, trying to find words for what I had seen. Recommend extended observation. Possible optical anomalies require further documentation. I stayed in that clearing until the light began to fail, taking measurements, attempting to collect samples, recording every observation I could articulate. The surface resisted all my tools. My diamond-tipped geological pick couldn't scratch it. My collection hammer bounced off as if striking solid steel. Whatever this thing was made of, it was harder than anything I had encountered in nature. As darkness crept through the forest, the humming grew louder. I retreated to my camp, but I didn't sleep. I lay in my tent staring at the canvas ceiling, trying to construct a rational explanation for what I had witnessed: geological formation, unknown mineral composition, unusual optical properties, environmental factors affecting perception. None of it explained the forest in the mirror that wasn't the forest behind me. Over the following 3 days, I expanded my search radius systematically, the way I had been trained. 1 mile east of the first monolith, I found another. This one was slightly smaller, perhaps 7 feet tall, but otherwise identical. The same impossible surface, the same low humming, the same sense of standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable. South of that, roughly equidistant from both previous formations, I discovered a third, then a fourth, then a fifth. By the end of the week, I had mapped 7 monoliths arranged in a pattern that made my blood run cold. They formed a precise geometric configuration, a triangle within a triangle, with a larger central monolith standing exactly at the calculated center point. This was not natural. This could not be natural. I had spent my career studying geological formations, and I knew with absolute certainty that nothing in nature arranged itself with this kind of mathematical precision. Someone or something had placed these objects here with deliberate intent. The central monolith stood nearly 12 feet tall, and the humming around it was different, deeper, resonating at a frequency that seemed to vibrate in my bones. When I approached it, my skin prickled with static electricity, the hair on my arms stood on end. And in the mirror surface, the other forest was clearer, more persistent. I could see it even without pressing my hand to the surface. A world layered over our own, visible only in reflection. I began leaving my observation posts at night, unable to sleep, unable to stop thinking about what these objects might be. On my 6th night in the field, I was awakened by the humming rising to a pitch I hadn't heard before. I grabbed my flashlight and crept toward the central clearing, keeping to the shadows, some instinct telling me to remain hidden. What I saw destroyed the last vestiges of my scientific materialism. The central monolith was glowing, not reflecting light, generating it. A soft pulsing luminescence that seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the humming, and moving toward it from the tree line, was a figure that stopped my heart. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, walking upright on 2 legs with a gait that was almost human, but utterly alien. Its body was covered in dark hair that caught the moonlight, its arms impossibly long, its shoulders broader than any human's could be. I pressed myself against a tree, my flashlight forgotten, my breath frozen in my lungs. The creature moved with a grace that belied its massive frame. It approached the glowing monolith with what I can only describe as reverence, its movements slow and deliberate. It paused at the mirror surface and raised one enormous hand, pressing it against the crystal. The surface rippled, that's the only way I can describe it. Like water when you drop a stone, except vertical, except solid. The creature leaned forward and stepped into the mirror as if walking through a doorway, and then it was gone. The glow faded, the humming subsided, the forest returned to its ordinary silence. I stood there for what felt like hours, my mind racing through possibilities and rejecting each one: hallucination, sleep deprivation, contaminated water supply. But I knew what I had seen. I knew it as surely as I knew my own name. Something lived in these woods, something that could walk between worlds. I had 2 choices. I could pack my equipment, hike back to civilization, file a standard geological report documenting unusual mineral formations, and never speak of this again. I could return to Linda, salvage my marriage, continue my career, and spend the rest of my life wondering what I had witnessed, or I could stay. The scientist in me had spent a lifetime seeking truth, even uncomfortable truth, especially uncomfortable truth. I had built my reputation on investigating anomalies that other researchers dismissed, on going where the evidence led regardless of how strange the destination. Could I really turn my back on the greatest mystery I had ever encountered? I radioed base camp the next morning with a fabricated report, unusual formations requiring extended documentation, request 60-day extension, request additional supplies at the trailhead drop point. The response came back within hours. Approval granted, supplies would be waiting. I rationed my food and began a systematic observation protocol. I established hidden watching posts near 3 of the monoliths, each positioned to give me a clear view while remaining concealed. I kept detailed notes of every occurrence, every anomaly, every impossible thing I witnessed. Over the following 2 weeks I saw the creatures multiple times, always at night, always near the monoliths. There were at least 3 distinct individuals that I could identify, distinguishable by their size and the coloration of their hair. The largest stood perhaps 9 feet tall, its coat almost black. Another was smaller, perhaps 7.5 feet, with reddish-brown coloring. The third had a distinctive streak of white through the hair on its chest, and this one seemed to command deference from the others. I began calling that one elder in my notes. They emerged from the monoliths and disappeared into them. They moved through the forest with purpose, sometimes carrying things, plants, stones, small animals. They never approached my camp directly, but I had the overwhelming sense that they knew I was there, watching them watch me. On the 18th day of my extended observation, I was documenting the smallest monolith when I turned around and found myself face to face with Elder. He stood 30 feet away, motionless, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that seemed to see through flesh and bone to something deeper. I froze, every muscle locked, my heart thundering so loud I was certain he could hear it. The face was humanoid but wrong, the brow ridge too heavy, the jaw too prominent, the proportions suggesting an intelligence that had evolved along a different path than our own. But the eyes held something I recognized: curiosity, awareness, a consciousness regarding another consciousness. We stared at each other for what felt like eternity compressed into seconds. My scientific training took over, overriding my terror. I remained still, kept my posture non-threatening, made no sudden movements. I had studied animal behavior. I knew how to signal peaceful intent. Slowly, deliberately, Elder raised one massive hand. The gesture was unmistakable. A greeting, an acknowledgement, a recognition of one intelligent being to another. My hand rose in response, seemingly of its own accord. Elder made a sound, a low rumbling vocalization that resonated in my chest. It might have been language. It felt like language. Then he turned and walked toward the nearest monolith, his gait unhurried, confident. At the mirror surface he paused and looked back at me. Something passed between us in that moment, some understanding that transcended words. Then he stepped through and vanished. I stood there trembling, my raised hand slowly falling to my side. Everything had changed. Everything. These creatures were not animals. They were not primitive. They were intelligent beings who had just acknowledged my existence, who had just extended something that could only be interpreted as welcome. That night I made a decision that would define everything that followed. I was no longer simply a geologist documenting an anomaly. I had become something else entirely, something I had no training for, something there was no protocol to guide. I had become humanity's first ambassador to something beyond our world. The days that followed that first acknowledgement became a careful dance of mutual observation and tentative trust. I understood, perhaps instinctively, that any sudden movement toward deeper contact could shatter whatever fragile bridge had begun to form between us. So I waited. I watched. And I began to leave offerings. It started simply enough: an apple from my dwindling supplies placed on a flat rock near the central monolith at sunset. The next morning the apple was gone. In its place sat a fruit I had never seen before. something that resembled a pear but with skin that shifted between purple and deep blue depending on the angle of light. I held it in my trembling hands for nearly an hour before I found the courage to taste it. The flavor was unlike anything in my experience, sweet and complex, with undertones that reminded me of honey and something else, something I can only describe as the taste of starlight, if such a thing were possible. This exchange became our language before we had any other. I would leave items, things I hoped might intrigue them. My compass, useless now in this magnetically confused landscape. A small hand mirror which seemed appropriate given the nature of the monoliths themselves. Colored pencils from my field kit. A photograph of Linda, though why I included that, I still cannot fully explain. Perhaps I wanted them to know that I too had connections, that I belonged to something larger than myself. Each offering disappeared. Each time something was left in return. A crystalline shard that seemed to have been broken from one of the monoliths, warm to the touch and pulsing with an energy I could feel resonating in my bones. Woven strands of plant fiber arranged in patterns too complex to be random. A stone worn smooth by what must have been centuries of handling, fitting perfectly in my palm, as if it had been shaped specifically for a human hand. Perhaps it had. Perhaps others had come before me, other humans who had stumbled upon these doorways and been deemed worthy of contact. One creature in particular began to appear with increasing frequency during these exchanges. It was slightly smaller than the others I had observed, standing perhaps 7.5 feet tall rather than the 8 or more that seemed typical. What distinguished it most clearly was a streak of white that ran through the reddish-brown hair of its chest, a natural marking that made identification unmistakable. In my field notes I began referring to this individual as Elder, based partly on the distinctive marking but more significantly on the behavior of the other creatures in its presence. They deferred to this one. They waited for its signals. There was a hierarchy among them, and this being stood somewhere near its apex. Elder began approaching closer during our exchanges, narrowing the distance between us from 30 feet to 20, then 15. Those intelligent eyes studied me with an intensity that was simultaneously unnerving and oddly comforting. I was being evaluated, measured, judged by criteria I could not begin to understand. Whatever conclusions Elder was reaching, they seemed to be in my favor, because the approaches continued. Our attempts at direct communication were primitive at first. I would speak words, knowing they couldn't understand the language, but hoping the tone, the rhythm, the emotional content might convey something. Elder would respond with vocalizations that ranged from low rumbles to higher-pitched sounds that almost resembled song. We gestured at objects, at each other, at the sky and trees and monoliths. I drew pictures in the dirt with a stick, simple representations of the sun, the moon, the forest, human figures, wanderer figures, standing side by side. Elder would study these drawings with obvious interest, occasionally adding marks of its own that I struggled to interpret. Progress was glacial, but it was real. We were learning each other. 7 weeks into my extended expedition, with my supplies running critically low and my scheduled return date long past, Elder appeared at the edge of my camp just as the sun began to set. I had become accustomed to these visits, but something about this evening felt different. There was an energy in the way the creature moved, a purpose that went beyond simple observation. Elder made a gesture I had never seen before, a sweeping motion with one massive arm that ended with the hand oriented toward the deeper forest, then again and again. The meaning was unmistakable, as clear as if it had been spoken in plain English. Come with me. My heart hammered against my ribs as I rose from my camp chair. Every instinct I possessed, both scientific and primal, screamed competing demands. The scientist wanted to follow, to observe, to learn. The animal wanted to flee, to return to the safety of the known world before it was too late. I stood frozen between these impulses for what felt like an eternity. Then I stepped forward and followed. Elder led me through the darkening forest with a certainty that suggested this path had been walked countless times before. We moved in silence. The only sounds our footfalls on the soft earth and the ever-present hum that grew stronger as we approached the central monolith. The creature moved with remarkable grace for its size, ducking beneath branches, stepping over fallen logs, navigating the terrain with an ease that made my own progress seem clumsy by comparison. When we reached the clearing, I understood immediately that something significant was about to occur. The central monolith was glowing, not the faint luminescence I had observed before, but a steady pulsing light that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within its crystalline structure. The air around it shimmered like heat rising from summer pavement, and the humming had taken on a harmonic quality, as if multiple frequencies were now resonating in concert. Elder approached the monolith and placed one enormous hand upon its surface. The mirror rippled at the touch, the reflection distorting into patterns that hurt my eyes to observe directly. Then the creature turned to look at me, and in that gaze I saw something I can only describe as invitation. It gestured toward the monolith, then back at itself, then at me. The meaning was clear. It was offering to show me something. It was asking me to follow where no human had ever followed before. Elder stepped through the rippling surface and vanished. I stood alone in the clearing, facing a doorway to another world, my entire body trembling with a mixture of terror and exhilaration that I have never experienced before or since. Everything I had ever believed about the nature of reality told me that what I was contemplating was impossible, and yet I had seen the creatures emerge from these mirrors. I had watched them return. The impossible had become, in this place, merely the unexplained. I thought of Linda, waiting at home with her growing resentment and her fading patience. I thought of my colleagues at the survey, who would declare me lost or dead if I never returned. I thought of the report I would never file, the career that would end in mystery rather than retirement. I thought of everything that defined the life of Marcus Whitfield, geologist, scientist, rational man. Then I placed my hand on the cool surface of the monolith and stepped forward. The transition was like nothing I can adequately describe, though I have spent 40 years trying to find the words. Imagine walking through cold water that doesn't make you wet, that offers resistance but also seems to pull you forward. Imagine a moment of absolute darkness so complete that you cannot even sense your own body, followed by light that enters not just through your eyes but through every cell of your being. Imagine the sensation of every atom in your body vibrating at a different frequency, shifting to match a reality that operates on principles entirely unlike your own. I emerged on the other side, gasping for breath, my knees weak, my vision swimming with colors that don't exist in the spectrum. I had known for 38 years. It took long moments for my senses to adjust, to begin processing the impossible world that now surrounded me. The forest was similar to the one I had left, but larger, grander, more ancient. The trees rose hundreds of feet into a sky tinged with violet and gold. 2 moons hung above the canopy, one larger than Earth's moon and glowing with a faint blue luminescence, the other smaller and tinged with amber. The air itself tasted different, charged with an energy that seemed to crackle on my tongue, alive in a way that made the atmosphere of my own world seem dead by comparison. And standing before me, arranged in a loose semicircle, were 8 of the creatures. Elder stood at the center, and surrounding it were 7 others of varying sizes and colorations. They watched me with expressions I had learned to recognize as curiosity, as welcome, as something approaching joy. I had crossed the threshold. I had stepped beyond the boundaries of my world into another reality entirely, and I was not alone. I spent 3 hours on the other side that first night, 3 hours that contained more wonder, more revelation, more fundamental reshaping of my understanding than all my previous decades of scientific study combined. The creatures, the wanderers as I came to call them, were patient with my overwhelmed attempts to observe and comprehend. They showed me their dwelling places, structures grown rather than built, organic architectures that seemed to be living extensions of the forest itself. They showed me their children, smaller creatures with eyes full of boundless curiosity, who approached me without fear, touching my clothing and skin with gentle fingers that conveyed more communication than any words could manage. They showed me their history. Through methods I still do not fully understand, Elder was able to share images directly with my mind, not telepathy in the science fiction sense, but something more subtle, a resonance between conscious beings that transcended the need for language. I saw their past in fragments, impressions rather than detailed records. I saw a time thousands of years ago when the wanderers had walked openly in the world I called home. I saw them interacting with human beings, sharing knowledge, receiving offerings, being worshipped as gods or feared as demons depending on the culture and the era. I saw the relationship sour as human civilizations grew more aggressive, more territorial, more inclined to destroy what they did not understand. I saw the wanderers hunted. I saw them killed. The images Elder shared with me were not gentle. They did not spare me the truth of what my species had done. I saw massive bodies pierced by spears and arrows. I saw doorways like the monoliths deliberately destroyed, shattered by human hands wielding human tools. I saw the wanderers retreat, step by step from a world that had become too dangerous to inhabit openly. They withdrew to the spaces between, to realities adjacent to our own, crossing through only when necessary to maintain the doorways that remained. We learned, Elder conveyed in impressions that needed no words, that your kind is not ready, perhaps you never will be. The sorrow in that communication was oceanic, the accumulated grief of countless generations watching the neighbors they had once called friends transform into something unrecognizable. They had not abandoned hope entirely, the doorways were still maintained, the watch was still kept. But the wanderers no longer expected humanity to change. Until me. Until that summer. Until a lone geologist stumbled into their sacred space and demonstrated something they had not seen in centuries, the capacity for wonder without violence, curiosity without conquest. When I finally stepped back through the monolith, returning to the familiar darkness of the Olympic forest, I understood that everything in my life had changed. I understood that the wanderers had chosen to trust me with knowledge that could transform human understanding of reality itself. And I understood the weight of the responsibility that trust implied. I had become the keeper of a secret that would define the remainder of my existence. The weeks that followed my first crossing became a fever dream of discovery and transformation. Each night I would wait for the sun to descend below the ancient canopy, and then I would make my way to the central monolith, where Elder would often be waiting. Sometimes I crossed through to their world, sometimes they crossed through to mine. And slowly, painstakingly, we built a bridge of understanding across the impossible gulf between our species. I learned that the wanderers had been watching humanity since before we built our first permanent settlements. They had witnessed the rise of agriculture, the construction of the pyramids, the fall of empires that we've forgotten ever existed. Through shared visions, Elder showed me glimpses of their observations, humans huddled around fires in Ice Age caves, humans building monuments to gods they barely understood, humans reaching for the stars while simultaneously perfecting new ways to destroy one another. The wanderers watched it all with the patient curiosity of beings who measure their lives in centuries rather than decades. They showed me other doorways, other nexus points scattered across the globe. I saw mirror monoliths hidden in the frozen wastes of Siberia, buried beneath the shifting sands of the Sahara, concealed in the unexplored depths of the Amazon rainforest. Each cluster was tended by wanderers who had dedicated their existence to maintaining the delicate membrane between dimensions. And I began to understand that what we call supernatural phenomena, what we dismiss as myth and legend and hallucination, is merely the occasional glimpse of this vast interdimensional reality that exists just beyond our limited perception. But with understanding came terror, because Elder also showed me what happens when the doorways are neglected, when the caretakers abandon their posts, when the dimensional fabric begins to unravel. I saw worlds that had died, not from war or plague or natural disaster, but from something far worse. When the boundaries between dimensions weaken, when the doorways crack and splinter without proper maintenance, reality itself becomes unstable. Matter behaves in impossible ways. Time loses its linear progression. Consciousness fragments into chaos. Elder projected images into my mind of civilizations that had existed in parallel dimensions, complex and beautiful and utterly destroyed by the cascading failure of their dimensional nexus points. The images burned themselves into my memory, cities twisted into geometric impossibilities, landscapes folded in on themselves like origami nightmares, beings caught in frozen moments of horror as their very existence became incompatible with the laws of physics that governed their reality. The wanderers are not merely caretakers of doorways, they are the last line of defense against a kind of cosmic unraveling that would make our worst apocalyptic fears seem quaint by comparison. And I understood then why they had chosen to reveal themselves to me. It wasn't simply because I had stumbled upon their sanctuary, it wasn't mere curiosity about a lone human who had wandered into their domain. They had been watching humanity's progress with growing concern. Our nuclear weapons, our particle accelerators, our increasingly sophisticated probes into the fundamental nature of matter and energy, all of it was bringing us closer to dimensions we had no understanding of and no way to safely navigate. We were children playing with matches in a room full of dynamite, and the Wanderers feared that our ignorance would eventually trigger the kind of catastrophic dimensional failure they had witnessed in other worlds. They showed me because they hoped I might find a way to warn my species. They trusted me because in all their millennia of observation, they had rarely encountered a human who could witness the truth and respond with wonder rather than violence, curiosity rather than conquest. By the end of my second month in those woods, I had filled 17 notebooks with observations, sketches, and my best attempts to transcribe the communication systems the Wanderers used. I had over 200 photographs, though many of them showed things that shouldn't be possible: landscapes from the other dimension, Wanderers in various settings, the monoliths glowing with their strange luminescence. I had physical samples, the crystalline shard Elder had given me, plant specimens from the parallel world, hair samples from the Wanderers themselves. I had, in short, enough evidence to revolutionize human understanding of reality. And I had a decision to make. On my 53rd day, I sat with Elder at the edge of the clearing where the central monolith stood. The creature had become, in its own alien way, something like a friend. We had developed a rudimentary ability to share thoughts, crude compared to what the Wanderers could do with each other but remarkable by human standards. I could feel Elder's presence in my mind like a warm pressure, patient and ancient and fundamentally kind. I asked, in the halting combination of gestures and projected images we had developed, what I should do with what I had learned. Should I bring this knowledge back to my people? Should I tell the world about the doorways, about the Wanderers, about the delicate fabric of reality that depended on their constant vigilance? Elder's response was complex, layered with emotions and memories that I could only partially comprehend. I felt the weight of centuries of bitter experience, the memories of trust betrayed and goodwill repaid with violence. I felt the deep sorrow of a species that had once reached out to humanity in friendship and received only fear and hatred in return. And I felt something else, a fragile, hesitant hope. The choice Elder conveyed was mine to make. The Wanderers would not stop me from sharing what I had learned. But I needed to understand the consequences. If I revealed the truth, some humans would believe me. They would come seeking the doorways, seeking the Wanderers, seeking to exploit or destroy or capture. The delicate balance that allowed the Wanderers to continue their work would be disrupted. The doorways themselves might become targets. But if I remained silent, humanity would continue its blind stumbling toward dimensional technologies we didn't understand, risking catastrophic consequences with each new experiment. The race between human discovery and human wisdom was one the Wanderers feared we would lose. There was, Elder suggested, a middle path. A way to prepare humanity for the truth without exposing the Wanderers to immediate danger. I could become a bridge, working slowly and carefully to shift human understanding, to plant seeds that might one day bloom into genuine comprehension. It would require patience. It would require sacrifice. It would mean carrying this burden alone, perhaps for the rest of my life. I thought of Linda waiting for me back in Seattle, probably wondering if this assignment would be the one that finally killed me. I thought of my colleagues at the USGS, rational men and women who would dismiss my discoveries as the delusions of a man who had spent too long alone in the wilderness. I thought of the journalists who would mock me, the scientists who would shun me, the institutions that would strip me of every credential I had spent my career earning. And I thought of the truth that burned in my mind like a star, the knowledge that reality was vaster and stranger, and more magnificent than anything humanity had ever imagined. I made my choice. On the morning of my 58th day, I packed my equipment and prepared to leave the forest. Elder accompanied me to the edge of the Nexus Zone, to the place where the influence of the monoliths faded and the ordinary world reasserted itself. We stood together in the dawnlight, two beings from different dimensions, connected by a bond that transcended the boundaries between worlds. Elder gave me one final gift, a small object that looked like a compass but was something far more complex. A way to find the doorways, to sense when the dimensional fabric was thin, to know when the wanderers were near. The creature conveyed that I should use it wisely, that it was a tool and a responsibility, that with it came an obligation to protect the secrets I had learned. Then Elder placed one massive hand on my shoulder, the first time the creature had deliberately touched me. The gesture conveyed more than any words could: trust, hope, farewell, and something that might have been love, if love could exist between beings as different as us. I walked away from the clearing, from the monoliths, from the doorway to another world. And I never looked back, because I knew that if I did, I would never be able to leave. When I returned to Seattle, I found that Linda had already left. A note on the kitchen table explained that she couldn't do this anymore, couldn't keep waiting for a man who loved his work more than his wife. I read the note, set it down, and felt almost nothing. The concerns of my former life seemed impossibly small compared to what I had experienced. I filed my report with the USGS. The crystalline formations, I wrote, were an unusual but natural geological phenomenon, probably the result of rare mineral deposits combined with specific environmental conditions. I recommended the area for further study, but emphasized that access should be restricted to protect the fragile ecosystem. The report was accepted without comment, filed away in some archive where it probably still gathers dust. But I kept the photographs. I kept the notebooks. I kept the samples and the crystal shard and the strange compass that Elder had given me. And I began my real work. For 43 years, I have lived with this secret. I have traveled to other nexus points around the world, confirming the wanderers' presence, documenting their activities, occasionally making contact with other caretakers who maintain other doorways. I have watched from the shadows as humanity has stumbled toward technologies that brush against dimensional boundaries, quantum computers that manipulate particles in ways that make the membrane between worlds shiver, particle accelerators that probe the fundamental fabric of space and time, experiments in consciousness that hint at realities beyond our own. I have published papers under pseudonyms, theoretical work that nudges scientific understanding toward the truths I cannot openly reveal. I have mentored students who I believed might one day be ready to receive this knowledge. I have planted seeds, as Elder suggested, hoping they might bloom in future generations. And I have watched as sightings of the wanderers, what the world calls Bigfoot and Sasquatch and 100 other names, have continued throughout the decades. Each sighting represents a crossing, a caretaker moving between dimensions to maintain doorways that most humans will never know exist. The skeptics mock these reports. The believers sensationalize them. But I know the truth that lies beneath both extremes. The wanderers are real. The doorways are real. The vast, interconnected web of dimensional reality that underpins our existence is real. And humanity stands at a crossroads, approaching a moment when we will either learn to navigate these truths with wisdom and humility, or stumble blindly into catastrophe. I am 71 years old, and I am dying. The cancer in my liver will claim me within 6 months, perhaps sooner. I have no children, no legacy beyond my unpublished notebooks and the memories of those who knew me as the eccentric old geologist who spent too much time in the wilderness. But before I go, I needed to tell this story. I needed someone to know what I discovered in that forest in the summer of 1981. I needed to plant one final seed. The mirror monoliths are still there, hidden in the remote reaches of Olympic National Park and in wild places around the world. The wanderers still maintain them, still cross between dimensions, still watch humanity with their ancient mixture of hope and caution. And the doorways they guard still hold back the chaos that would consume us all if the dimensional fabric were to fail. Perhaps you think I am a madman. Perhaps you have already dismissed everything I have said as the ramblings of a dying old fool. That is your choice, and I respect it. The wanderers taught me that every being must find their own path to truth. But if even a small part of you wonders whether reality might be larger and stranger than you have been taught to believe, if even a small part of you senses that there are mysteries in this universe that science has not yet explained, then I ask you to remember this story. Remember the mirror monoliths in the forest. Remember the interdimensional beings who have watched over humanity for millennia. And remember that the boundaries of the possible are far wider than we dare to imagine. I do not know what happens when we die. But part of me hopes that the doorways Elder showed me lead not just to other dimensions in this life, but to whatever lies beyond. Perhaps I will find out soon enough. Until then, I remain what I have always been: a scientist, a seeker, a keeper of impossible truths. And now, at last, I am no longer alone in knowing them.